Chapter 6. Mengele Bardringle and his mate Renival, both recent immigrants from the planet of Traxxas, were preparing for the journey to their home planet. It had been about 4 years since they had come to Galimar. At the time, the prospect of living on a planet that wasn't their own was quite extraordinary among their contemporaries. It had been around 7 decades since the Galimarian people had made first contact with the people of Traxxas, and since then their respective cultures had shared quite a bit with each other. The people of Galimar were far more advanced than the numerous political and social cultures they encountered on Traxxas. But contrary to the conspiracy theorists that seemingly love to hear themselves talk, all Galimarians seemed to be truly peaceful. This, of course, was in sharp contrast to the nations of Traxxas that, up until the Treaty of Vordoon, had regularly found themselves at war with the other nations of their own planet, for any number of reasons. Bardringle and Renival both came from the United Nation of Aegon, and so any news from their home planet that concerned the UNA was of particular interest to them. The existence of this treaty and the fact that all planetary nations ratified it was the main reason why Galimar had felt comfortable with the establishment of diplomatic relations with Traxxas. Galimarians refused to deal with any single nation, but rather would only communicate with the entire planet through the United League of Vordoon, or ULV for short. Now, though, Bardringle and Renival were preparing to leave for their home planet, since the news coming from their planet wasn't exactly positive. The news lately had taken on a tone that was much more inflationary, since there were several political factions that were being rather vocal in their displeasure over the treaty. Many of them spouted venom over the perceived unfairness of the way the disputed lands and borders had been divided according to the treaty. And, truth be said, there were some nations that seemed to have a little more in terms of natural resources within their borders than nations that may exist next door. Still, though, all nations had ratified the treaty with their respective eyes open, and so there was no way to substantiate the various claims of unfairness. The United Nation of Aegon happened to be one of those nations that seemed to have a little of everything when it came to natural resources. The southeastern section of the continent, where they found themselves, contained quite a lot of arable farmland, where seemingly anything could be grown. In the north were dense timberlands, and the west butted up against a large ocean where an unending supply of sea creatures could be found for food. The southwest held mines that yielded some of the richest supplies of just about any natural mineral needed. There were those in the government of the UNA that were concerned about a neighboring nation that had been doing a little too much saber-rattling over their claims of unfairness in the Treaty of Vordoon. Bardringle and Renival had been asked to come back home to help with the defense of the nation in case it was needed. Before the treaty, the two of them were officers in the UNA Army, and so they had quite a lot of experience with tactical battle strategy and with running a command of their own. When the treaty was signed, it effectively left them without a job, although the government had guaranteed that they would be cared for in honor of their many years of service to the country. Now, though, their futures were once again cast in an uncertain light.
"Well, that just about does it."
"What does, honey?" replied Renival to her husband of 8 years.
"The packing of my study. I had to order about 12 more travel cases to hold all my junk in there,"
he replied with a slight chuckle.
"I didn't really expect to be returning back home to live, and so I didn't really give any thought about remaining light on my feet. It's mostly just books, though."
"Sounds heavy," she said.
"It is a little, but we've been given a pretty decent weight allotment on the shuttle launch next week, so I think we'll be okay."
he replied. Well, we haven't even begun to pack the kitchen, she retorted. And so, don't be so sure we... Ding dong. The two of them stopped their exchange and looked at each other with a quizzical look.
Were you expecting anyone?
Asked Bardringle. No, not that I can think of, she replied. The two of them both rose from their temporary resting place on the couch and walked to the door. Opening the door, Bardringle saw their friend and Galimarian confidant, Galimar, standing there with a look of concern on his face.
Hey, you two, are you all right?
He asked Bardringle and Renival.
Yes,
answered Bardringle with a tone of unsure expectation in his voice. He really had no idea why his friend, who was usually pretty predictable, now had this mysterious affect about him.
Why wouldn't we be?
You mean you haven't heard? Asked their visitor. Heard what? Asked Renival, a tone of fear now entering her voice. It's all over the news. I'm shocked you haven't seen it, replied Galimar.
Well, we've been packing for our trip back to Traxxas all day and haven't been watching the news,
replied Bardringle. I think your plans are going to change, said Galimar with a foreboding sound. Pushing past them, Galimar touched the side of the vid monitor on the wall of their living room, and it instantly lit up with scenes of utter devastation. What could be seen through what looked like a toxic soup of atmosphere was nothing less than the charred remains of a city that had been completely destroyed. Where is this? What happened? Asked Renival. Just then, a voice came from the vid screen. A news announcer began to describe what was being shown. For those of you who have just tuned in, our top story is the sad news that the planet of Traxxas has suffered a devastating planet-wide event, resulting in what appears to be the complete destruction of all life on the planet. Renival shrieked, and her hand went to cover her mouth. Bardringle immediately rushed to his wife's side. However, he wasn't exactly doing much better than her. The news announcer continued. The images you see here are just now coming in from a probe sent in from a Galimarian news satellite that is in orbit around the planet. At this time, there isn't much to go on as to why or how this happened. But all we can tell you at this point is that the normal influx of radio and television transmissions that come from this planet have all ceased completely. According to our science editor, as well as several experts on staff in our main studios, it appears that the atmosphere of the planet has been contaminated on a planet-wide scale and would be deadly lethal to any Traxian on the surface. Bardringle and Renival felt the blood drain from their faces, and it felt like all extremities were tingling. They both had to quickly find a seat as they continued to witness the obvious and complete carnage on their home planet, since their legs were threatening to give out. On the communication line with us now is our chief science editor, Kosha Manea. Kosha, what can you tell us about the images we are now seeing? Well, Lane, the images mostly speak for themselves, really. As you can see from the video of the city of Antioch, the devastation is utterly complete. Bardringle let out an audible gasp of his own now. His youth was spent in a city near Antioch. What can you tell us about the atmosphere? Asked the news anchor. All that we can tell you, so far, is that it appears to be a toxic soup of different gases, but the specific properties of this soup are unclear. At this time, we have no information on what kind of cataclysm could cause this, short of a massive volcanic eruption. How pervasive is this devastation on the planet, Kosha? We're still evaluating the data pouring in from not only our own satellites around the planet, but also Traxian satellites that we have been granted access to in the past. All that we can tell you is that, so far, there doesn't seem to be any part of the planet that hasn't been touched by this disaster. In your experience, could there be an explanation for this that might come from outside the planet? Like what we saw happen with the planet Palamine when its sun exploded? Well, we can't rule out an extraplanetary causality for this level of destruction. However, we can tell you that the Traxian sun is stable and in no way caused this catastrophe. Very well, Kosha. We appreciate your input, and we look forward to hearing from you as soon as you learn more about this terrible news. You're welcome, Lone. I'll be back in touch if I learn any more. Once again, this is the Galimarian Planetary News Agency, and we're bringing you news about the devastating... The news anchor started to repeat the news. Bardringle and Ren-Ivel both looked at the floor in front of them and tried their best to wrap their brains around what they had just heard. It took some time to navigate their way through thoughts of how many cities had apparently been destroyed. However, they almost simultaneously started to realize that all the family they had left behind on the planet were now most likely all... The two of them may have been officers in the army, but this was too much to emotionally stand against. Years of combat training and the years of emotional calluses built up when some under their command didn't make it home from the theater of war. It was no match for this. This was far beyond anything they had ever thought they would have to deal with. First one tier, then two, then thousands or millions. They were uncountable, unending, and unyielding. Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.